She wasn't tried in a courtroom. She was tried in the street, in the river, in fire, and in stone. A whisper could strip a woman of her name, her face, even her life while the men walked free. What followed was not chaos, but a system. In medieval Europe, marriage was not mainly a private romance. It was a legal and economic arrangement that tied land, labor, and lineage together. A wife entered a household under her husband's authority, and many legal systems treated her public identity as covered by his, meaning her property, debts, and social standing flowed through him. This wasn't uniform everywhere, but the broad pattern across Latin Christian Europe was clear. A married woman's sexuality was not framed as her own private choice. It was a matter of family honor and inheritance, security. That obsession with control makes more sense when you remember what was at stake. In a world without DNA tests, even without consistent written records, bloodline was the currency of power. An heir meant continuity of land, titles, alliances, and a family's survival. If a wife had a child outside marriage, medieval law and custom often treated it less as a personal betrayal and more as a threat to property. An uncertain heir could redirect wealth to another man's line, weaken treaties, or trigger feuds that lasted generations. That is why adultery was understood through the lens of ownership and violation of another man's rights, not simply moral failing. Religion added another layer. Church teaching condemned adultery for both sexes in theory, but in practice communities focused far more on women, because a woman's pregnancy made lineage visible in a way a man's infidelity did not. The same canon culture that preached spiritual order also reinforced social order, so the female body became the battlefield where honor, sin, and inheritance were policed. Out of that worldview came punishments that look monstrous to us now, but were logical to them. These penalties were not just about correcting one marriage, they were public, ritualized, and often compulsory to witness, because the real target was the entire village. When a woman was shamed, tested, or mutilated, the spectacle was meant to burn a lesson into every other woman watching and into every man who needed reassurance that the system protected his line. Even ordeals, later restricted by the church in 1215, persisted locally because they served a social function beyond truth-finding. So the violence that followed accusations was not random cruelty. It was a carefully maintained technology of fear designed to make female sexuality a controlled public resource, and to keep every woman obedient not only to her husband, but to the entire social order around her. In medieval Europe, accusations of female adultery rarely began with anything we would recognize as solid evidence. They usually started the way fear starts in any tight community, with suspicion, jealousy, and gossip that traveled faster than truth. A husband who felt humiliated, a rival family looking for leverage, a neighbor nursing an old grievance, even a local priest convinced that moral order was slipping. Any of these could ignite a charge, because adultery was framed less as a private sin and more as a violation of male property and lineage. A husband's certainty carried immense weight. If he said his wife had dishonored him, the question often became not, is it proven, but how must the community respond to protect order? Small towns and villages made this worse. Everyone's lives overlapped in marketplaces, wells, churches, and harvest fields. Privacy was thin, and reputation was everything. A woman seen talking with a man too long, walking home at the wrong hour, or simply disliked for being outspoken could become a target. Inheritance disputes were a particularly dangerous fuel. If a family wanted to remove a woman who stood between them and land, or if a husband's relatives feared a child might not be of the line, an accusation could be a ruthless shortcut. Medieval courts recorded many sexuality cases that were inseparable from household economics and local power struggles, because marriage and property were legally fused. What mattered most is that the evidentiary bar was low by modern standards. Testimony from neighbors, reputation for loose behavior, or a husband's assertion could be treated as enough to proceed. Canon law technically demanded proof, but practice in secular and local jurisdictions often leaned on communal belief and moral panic, especially when the accused was a woman of ordinary status. Female adulterers were pursued more aggressively than men, partly because pregnancy could threaten inheritance in a visible way, so the system built its suspicion around women first. Once the rumor hardened into accusation, the social machinery took over. The community was not a neutral observer, it was an active participant. Medieval punishment for adultery often required public involvement. Whipping, head shaving, parading precisely because the goal was collective enforcement, not just private correction. The process turned neighbors into witnesses, and witnesses into instruments of shame, because a spectacle is more effective than a verdict when you want to discipline an entire population. So at the moment of accusation, a woman was already sliding into a script written long before her. The charge did not simply call her behavior into question, it called the community's anxiety about honor, bloodline, and control into action. And that is the doorway to what comes next. Because once a wife was labeled adulteress, the real trial was never designed to discover truth. It was designed to perform terror so loudly and so publicly that every other woman would understand the cost of being suspected. In many medieval towns, when an accusation of adultery could not be proven to the strictest legal standard, authorities often reached first for what they called the lenient remedy, public penance. It sounds mild on paper, but in lived reality it was a ritual built to dismantle a woman's identity in front of everyone she depended on. Across late medieval Europe, especially in parts of France, the Low Countries, Germany, and England, municipal courts used a mix of religious penance and civic humiliation, and the harshest, most spectacular forms were aimed at wives. The punishment typically began with shaving. Hair in medieval Christian symbolism was tied to feminine honor, modesty, and marital status. To cut it off was to announce that a woman had fallen outside the protection of proper womanhood. Sources from different periods speak of shorn or cropped hair as a recognized marker of sexual disgrace, a visual sentence meant to last long after the day of punishment. The act was public and deliberate, not a neat trimming, but a transformation into someone socially unmade. Even before she walked a step, she was being reclassified in the eyes of her world. Then came stripping, which varied by region and time but carried the same intent. Some courts required a thin shift, others mandated near nudity for adulteresses, because public exposure was treated as a spiritual and social contamination, not merely embarrassment. We know from cases like the 1483 penance of Jane Shaw in London and from customary practices in 13th–14th century France that women convicted or publicly branded as sexually transgressive could be forced to walk barefoot in minimal clothing. Through crowded streets, the method was not random. It weaponized shame by turning the body itself into the evidence. What followed was the procession called carting, running, or a penance walk depending on place. Town authorities did not choose quiet back lanes. They chose the most familiar routes, past the market, the church door, the wells, the homes of kin and neighbors. In some cities, this run was a formal sentence for adultery, especially in aggravated cases, and it was designed as civic theater. The streets were the courtroom, and the village was the jury. Crucially, the village was not allowed to be passive. Communal shaming customs, such as chivalry or Skimmington-style processions, show a long tradition of rough music justice, where neighbors were expected to gather, mock, and discipline those who violated sexual or marital norms. Participation created complicity. A woman was not only punished by officials, she was punished by the social world that fed her, hired her, prayed beside her, and raised her children. That is why the violence of crowd spitting, throwing refuse, jeering, sometimes striking was not treated as disorder. It was part of the sentence in practice, because it taught everyone else what obedience cost. The psychological target was larger than one body. Shaving erased feminine identity. Stripping erased dignity. The walk erased belonging. It pulled a woman through the places that had defined her life and restamped them with rejection. Even if she survived without physical collapse, the real punishment continued. Municipal records and later commentary make clear that public penance could destroy a woman's ability to work, remarry, or reclaim respect. The stigma clung for years, sometimes for life. In that sense, the merciful punishment did what a blade could not. It left her alive, but socially dead, a warning that walked for a medieval community. The ordeal by cold water was not a carnival of cruelty in their own eyes. It was a courtroom without walls, built on the belief that God would not allow an innocent person to be condemned. Ordeals were described as judicium dath, a judgment of God, and because divine judgment was thought to be perfect, the ritual did not need the careful evidence standards we expect today. That belief is what made the practice so terrifying. Once a woman was accused, her fate could be handed over to a river. The scene usually formed at dawn. Villagers gathered by order or custom, because ordeals were public events meant to settle doubt in front of everyone. A priest stood at the center, not as a neutral observer but as the one who transformed ordinary water into holy water. Clerics were required to bless the river or pond and to recite prayers calling on God to reveal the truth, a step so essential that when the church later forbade priests from participating in ordeals in 1215, the whole system began to collapse. The accused woman was brought forward and stripped down to a thin shift or undergarment. She would then be bound in a specific way that appears in multiple legal and descriptive sources: wrists tied, ankles tied, sometimes with the right thumb fastened to the left toe and the left thumb to the right toe, curling the body into a posture that made swimming almost impossible. In some places, a rope was attached not to save her, but to pull her out or retrieve her body after the verdict. The point was to place her helplessly into God's hands and the community's gaze at the same time. Then came the moment of submission. She was lowered or thrown into the water, sometimes made to step in herself, while the priest and crowd watched. The logic was brutally simple. Pure, blessed water would accept the innocent and reject the guilty. If she floated on the surface, it meant the water had cast her out as a sinner, and she could be declared guilty on the spot. If she sank, it meant the water had received her as innocent. The theology sounded clean. The physics was a nightmare. A bound body's buoyancy depends on air in the lungs, body fat, panic breathing, cold shock, and the water's temperature. A terrified woman could gasp, trap air, and float briefly. That moment of floating just a few seconds could be read as proof of guilt, but sinking carried its own sentence. If she went under, officials had to decide how long to wait before pulling her out. Some were hauled up quickly, others were left longer to let God speak. Either way, being tied and submerged could cause near drowning, brain injury, or death, even when innocence was declared. Medieval records show ordeals functioning as verdicts, but also as deadly trials where survival was never guaranteed. That is the spiritual trap at the heart of cold water justice. If she floated and was condemned, it meant God rejected her. If she sank and died, it still meant God had judged her innocent in theory, dead in practice. The community could walk away believing divine truth had been revealed, even when the outcome was fatal either way. Modern observers sometimes imagine these ordeals as irrational barbarism, but their power came from something darker. They were psychologically coherent, inside a world that trusted God's visible intervention more than human testimony. By the 13th century, church authorities increasingly withdrew from such rituals, and later in the 4th's prohibition on clerical blessing was a turning point. Yet local communities often continued ordeals for decades, sometimes reframing them as tests rather than sacraments, because the spectacle still served its purpose, disciplining fear through public judgment. And even when water began to fade as an official tool, the system had other ordeals: waiting fire, iron, and punishments designed not just to decide guilt, but to make terror unforgettable. When cold water could not settle an accusation, or when a community wanted a harsher sign, medieval courts turned to fire. The ordeal by hot iron was one of the most widespread judgments of God across Europe, from roughly the 9th to early 13th centuries, especially in England and parts of the German lands. Like the water test, it rested on the same religious logic. God would physically protect the innocent and expose the guilty. To medieval minds, this was not superstition but justice at its most pure, because it removed human doubt and replaced it with divine certainty. The procedure followed a ritual script. A priest blessed the iron, sometimes a bar. Sometimes a plowshare then blessed the accused and prayed for God's verdict. The iron was heated until red-hot in front of witnesses. The woman was required to carry it a set distance, often measured in paces, or to walk over heated shares laid on the ground. Immediately after, her hand was wrapped and sealed, and the village waited several days before the bandage was officially removed. The wound's appearance would decide guilt. Clean healing meant innocence. Infection or severe burning meant guilt. On paper, this sounded like a fair test. In reality, it was a rigged logic disguised as sacred procedure. Medieval Europe had no antiseptics, no germ theory, and no reliable wound care. Infection was common even in ordinary cuts, let alone deep burns. So the outcome was structurally tilted toward conviction. If a woman's burns became inflamed, as they often did in a world of dirty bandages, smoky homes, and constant labor, the system read it as moral proof. If she healed better than expected, That was not seen as a reason to question the method. It was claimed as evidence of God's mercy. Either way, the ordeal protected itself. The ritual could never be wrong, because any result was absorbed into a theological explanation. This is why ordeals were so effective as instruments of control. They were not only physical tests, but psychological traps. A terrified accused woman was forced to walk into pain, believing that God was watching her body like a courtroom. If she emerged innocent, she still carried scars. If she was judged guilty, she faced punishment or death with the weight of divine verdict behind it. The community did not need witnesses or proof in the modern sense. The spectacle itself made belief feel inevitable. Then came the great irony. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. The official reason was not outrage at suffering. It was theological. Forcing God to reveal judgment on demand through ritual was seen as improper, even disrespectful to the divine. Without a priest to bless the iron or the water, the ordeal lost its sacramental authority. And in places like England, it rapidly declined in formal courts soon afterward. Yet the disappearance was uneven. Some regions quietly continued the practice or rebranded it as a test, because communities still wanted visible, terrifying judgments that did not rely on careful investigation. And when ordeals finally began to fade, the hunger for public certainty did not vanish with them. The system shifted toward punishments that were even more openly theatrical: penance walks, mutilation, branding methods that no longer pretended to discover truth, but instead marked the body as a warning. Water and iron had been God's courtroom. What replaced them was something colder: justice as permanent spectacle. When medieval ordeals began to fade, communities did not become gentler. They simply shifted from "God will reveal the truth" to "we will mark the body so no one ever forgets the lesson." Across early and high medieval Europe, many legal traditions treated facial disfigurement as an appropriate penalty for sexual crimes, and adulterous wives were among the most frequent targets. The face and head mattered because they were the most visible parts of the body. A punishment carved there turned a private accusation into a permanent public record. Some of the starkest examples come from early medieval law codes. In England, provisions associated with the reign of King Canute, 11th century, and related Anglo-Saxon legal culture prescribed mutilation for women convicted of adulteress, cutting off the nose and ears, and the forfeiture of property. Even if enforcement varied, the presence of these clauses shows that lawmakers imagined adultery as a crime worthy of visible, lifelong disfigurement, not merely a moral lapse. Similar penalties appear in other European legal spheres, influenced by Germanic and Byzantine traditions, where nose-cutting for adultery is explicitly mentioned as a sanctioned sentence. The act itself was staged as a civic spectacle. A woman would be taken to a square or market space, because that was where a community learned its rules. The cutting was usually done by someone whose job involved blades: an executioner, barber, or blacksmith paid by the town or lord. Medieval records of bodily punishments show that mutilation was not improvised rage. It was administration. The crowd's role was to witness and absorb the warning, because every mutilated face was meant to discipline future behavior. Branding and other permanent marks were also used in some regions and later periods, especially where civic courts wanted a visible stigma without killing the accused. Although the famous scarlet A is a much later Puritan symbol, medieval Europe did use bodily signs of shame: hair removal, facial marking, and disfigurement precisely to make a woman's alleged sexual crime readable at a glance. The goal was the same as mutilation: to create a living, moving warning inside the social world. What happened after the square was the real punishment. A woman missing a nose or ears, or otherwise branded as sexually transgressive, carried a sentence that never ended. Disfigurement made ordinary survival harder. Employers refused to hire her. Households feared association, and remarriage became nearly impossible. Medieval society depended on reputation as much as labor, and a mutilated face announced disgrace before a woman could speak. Historians studying disfigurement note that such penalties functioned as social exile. Written onto skin. Physical consequences followed quickly. Deep cuts and cauterized wounds in a pre-antiseptic world often became infected. Fever, sepsis, and slow decline were common outcomes of facial mutilation, even when death was not the court's stated aim. If a woman later died from infection or starvation, the system treated it as an after-effect of justice, not a new crime. The mark had done its job. It punished one body, but it warned every other woman who saw it. When the accused woman belonged to a powerful family, medieval justice often changed its costume but not its purpose. A peasant wife could be paraded or mutilated in the square. A noblewoman threatened something larger: dynastic legitimacy, alliance, politics, and the reputation of a ruling house. So instead of a public spectacle that could embarrass a court, the system used silence. The most famous example is the French royal scandal of 1314, known as the Tour de Nesle affair, when Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy, daughters-in-law of King Philip IV, were accused and convicted of adultery. Their alleged lovers were tortured and executed brutally in public, but the women themselves were given a punishment tailored to their rank. Their heads were shaved, and they were locked away for life in fortress cells. Margaret was taken to Château Galliard in Normandy and held in an underground chamber. Blanche was also confined there for years before being transferred to a convent. The records emphasize not comfort but removal. These were not normal prison stays. They were engineered disappearances. A noblewoman's enclosure meant thick stone walls that swallowed sound, a narrow window that offered light but not freedom, guards who delivered food without conversation, and days that lost their shape because nothing changed except the temperature of the cell and the rhythm of survival. Margaret died in captivity in 1315, still technically Queen of France because her husband Louis X had become king. Blanche survived longer, but sources note her health was broken by years of confinement. To understand why this was considered a fitting sentence, you have to see what it protected. A public execution of a princess would stain the monarchy and invite dangerous questions about succession. Yet allowing her to return to court was impossible, because her body, like any wife's body in this system, was tied to lineage certainty. Perpetual enclosure solved both problems. It erased the woman from political life without creating a martyr, and it let the dynasty continue, as if the scandal had been cut out like a diseased limb. This is why enclosure can read as worse than death. It did not end suffering. It stretched it. It turned time itself into punishment. A noblewoman was not only removed from society, she was removed from memory. Her voice could not defend her, her presence could not trouble alliances, and her slow decline happened off stage, where it would not disturb the public order. Medieval courts called this restraint, even mercy. In practice it was a refined form of destruction, one that preserved the dignity of powerful men while annihilating the woman in darkness. And the message remained the same as in the streets. Once accused, a wife's life was no longer hers, and the system would decide whether she was to be broken loudly or erased quietly. Among the punishments that haunted medieval imagination, few were as final or as claustrophobic as immurement, the act of sealing a living person behind stone. It was never the everyday sentence for adultery in most European courts, and historians treat many tales of women walled up alive with caution, because some are later legends woven around castles and churches. But immurement did exist in Europe as a rare, extreme penalty, and its very possibility shows how far a society could go. When it wanted a body erased without public bloodshed, the logic was cruelly simple. A condemned woman would be placed in a tiny cell, sometimes a niche in a wall, sometimes a narrow chamber inside a fortress or city structure, and the entrance would be bricked shut. In some documented European cases, only a small opening was left to pass food and remove waste. The body remained alive, but the person was removed from society as completely as if she had died. Even where we lack consistent court records tying immurement specifically to adultery, the punishment appears in historical accounts for other crimes and in repeated medieval and early modern traditions of entombment as justice, which tells us it was a real instrument within the wider culture of punishment. Inside such a space, time stopped behaving normally. With light reduced to a thin pulse through a slit, days could not be measured by work, seasons, or community rhythms. Sound became dull and distant. The cell was not only a cage, it was sensory deprivation. Medieval people did not have modern language for psychological trauma, but they understood that isolation could break a person. Chroniclers who mention immurement or long-sealed confinement describe police screams that weakened over weeks, and then silence, a pattern that aligns chillingly with what we now know about humans deteriorating under extreme solitude. Today, human rights research considers prolonged solitary confinement a form of torture because of its predictable effects on memory, sleep, perception, and sanity. Mentioning that comparison does not modernize the past. It helps us name what the medieval world was doing without needing to invent feelings or scenes. The method was designed to destroy a person slowly, without the mess of a public execution. And yet, in the medieval moral framework, this could still be described as mercy. A woman sealed into a living tomb was said to be given time to repent, to purify her soul in silence before death. The suffering was not an embarrassment to the system, it was its proof. To them, the erasure of a woman in darkness was not cruelty for its own sake. It was protection of order carried out so quietly that only the stones could witness it. To understand why the punishments were so extreme, you have to turn the camera toward the men standing around the square. Medieval moral teaching condemned adultery in principle for both sexes, but the law that communities actually lived by ran on a blunt double standard. Across much of medieval Europe, a woman's extramarital sex was automatically adultery. For a man, the same act often counted only if he slept with another man's wife, because the real crime was framed as trespassing on someone else's property rights, not violating an abstract moral rule. A married man could keep a mistress, visit prostitutes, or father illegitimate children, and it was treated as fornication or a minor sin, while a wife's suspected infidelity threatened lineage and inheritance. That imbalance shaped punishments on the ground. Women were far more likely to face public shaming, mutilation, ordeals, or lifelong enclosure, while men were frequently assigned fines, temporary banishment, or light penance, especially in late medieval urban courts where monetary settlements became common. By the 14th and 15th centuries in many towns, the run or public procession could be replaced by payment, and men, because they typically controlled wealth and civic standing, were better positioned to buy their way out. Even where legal theory sounded equal, practice kept escape routes open for males. Trial by combat, a respected form of proof in Germanic and feudal law, was overwhelmingly a male privilege. Men could demand a judicial duel to defend their honor or refute an accusation. Women were generally barred from fighting themselves and, at best, could hope for a male champion. That meant a man's body could be a weapon of legal defense, while a woman's body was the object being judged and disciplined. Seen from this angle, the system stops looking like a campaign for sexual morality. It looks like a mechanism for protecting ownership and inheritance. A woman's fidelity mattered because it guaranteed a man's bloodline. A man's infidelity mattered only when it damaged another man's line. The terror was never mainly about sin. It was about control of property, of legitimacy, and of women's bodies as the guarded gateway to family power. The scene you opened with, a woman's body turned into a public stage for punishment, feels medieval, distant, almost unreal. But the logic behind it did not die with the Middle Ages. What these communities built was a social technology. Take a private accusation, make it visible, make it humiliating, and let fear do the rest. They wrapped it in law and holiness, but at its core it was the same engine we've traced through every chapter: control of women's bodies to protect male honor, property, and inheritance. When the rituals of cold water and hot iron faded, the instinct to police female sexuality through unequal standards stayed alive. Over centuries, the forms changed. The village square became the courtroom, the church pew, the newspaper column, the workplace whisper, the online pylon. Public shame still gets used as a weapon, and the double standard still shows up whenever women are judged more harshly for the same acts men are excused for. The medieval world made that system visible in blood and iron. Modern societies often make it invisible behind respectability, tradition, or community values, but the pattern is recognizable if we're willing to look. That's why this history matters, not to flatter ourselves that we're better, but to understand how easily ordinary people can be trained to mistake cruelty for justice. If any part of this story shocked you, tell me which moment hit you hardest, and why. And if you want more honest dives into the uncomfortable corners of history, join this channel. We're building a space for people who don't look away, because the past only stays buried when we let it.